Hello and welcome to Can Month Day 6. Today we're going to be talking about colonialism and Canada as a settler colonial society. But before we get into that, I'm going to talk about my disillusion with Canada more generally, because then it'll make more sense as to why I tend to talk about Canada so negatively all of the time. Growing up, I was in love with Canada. I by no means thought it was the greatest country, because no country is the greatest country. I don't even know why you would try to assert that claim, because like on what ground, it just doesn't make sense. I knew Canada wasn't perfect, and I knew there were still problems, even particularly with race, because my mother has done a lot of advocacy work for refugees and people who have immigrated to Canada, so I knew our immigration system was deeply flawed. And the way that we deal with environmental issues. I knew that poverty and homelessness was a big issue. Our involvement in the international community as of late was just gross. But I knew that there were also so many other good things about Canada. And it is true, there are lots of good things about Canada. Same-sex marriage has been legal since 2005. Abortion is legal. We have some form of state welfarism and have quite a few social services for a North American country, like universal healthcare. So even though I knew Canada had some problems, I thought that they could just be addressed and fixed at some point, and then we would be good. In terms of my early understandings of colonialism, most Canadians get told what I would call the colonial myth, is that there were Indigenous people living in Canada first, and then white settlers came. There was some conflict there, but there was trade partnerships and the fur trade and all that. It kind of got worked out, and Indigenous people live on reserves now. Like that was the entire understanding. Definitely until like around the end of high school, when you started learning more about actual specific conflicts and wars that did happen. But that still just kind of leads into the idea of like, there were some conflicts at first, but then it got worked out mostly. There's a little bit more of an understanding of what Indigenous people have to face now in terms of living in Canada, but there's still a complete disconnect between what happened in the colonial period and what's happening in the post-colonial period. Like, there was no understanding of a link between those two, and that's terrifying. A lot of people tend to go their whole life thinking that the colonial myth is the foundation of Canada, and not that it was actually founded on genocide. And that leads into the foundation myth in Canada, that there were three groups that came together to form the state, which were French Canada, English Canada, and Indigenous peoples. But that's discussed as if Indigenous people were an equal member of that partnership, which is not true. And this is apparent to a lot of people. You might be thinking like, Ileana, yeah, we get it, colonialism, it's a thing. However, there are still so many people that do not get it. Or there are people who be like, yeah, obviously colonialism happened, but it was so long ago. And of course the country was founded by racist old white men. Everyone was like that back then. It was the 1800s, but now we're in the present and we just need to move on. So there's still a lack of understanding of neocolonialism and the fact that systems of colonial oppression are still prevalent and active today. And I am a white person talking about colonialism right now, and I recognize that. I'm complicit in systems of colonial oppression because I receive white settler privilege. Where I'm trying to come from in discussing this is that oppressive groups of people basically need to educate themselves. Here are some resources. So that's basically what I'm going for here. And it's really hard for people to understand that this is happening in Canada, because we're seen as this unassuming, peaceful country, and we have liberal equality and liberal multiculturalism. Like, how could anything this horrific happen or still be happening in Canada? Like, if you talk to people from the United States, they'll actually be like, oh no, you don't understand, like, what happened to Indigenous people in the US is so much worse than what happened in Canada. Like, no, I don't think you understand. Like, look, all this stuff happened. And it's like, no, the same stuff happened in Canada. There were scalping policies. There was the intentional spread of smallpox blankets. There was warfare and reservations and the forced introduction of a treaty system, and then the total violation of that system. Residential schools and the outline of culture. I mean, listing off things like this, it is important to recognize that there always has been resistance against this. Then I came to an understanding of Canada as being founded in colonial genocide, and that this is institutionalized into the entire framework of the state. And to illustrate that, The current leader of our country, our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, has made continual comments about how Canada doesn't have a colonial history, and regarding calls for inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women, that the increased numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada has nothing to do with sociological factors. It's just because people murder each other. There is no need to look at the context of colonial violence in this case. So, reminder that there's an election in October of this year. Heave Steve 2K15. Canada has also been condemned by the United Nations and Amnesty International for their treatment of Indigenous people. Canada has also not signed onto anything at the United Nations that asserts that access to clean drinkable water is a right, because if they did that, they would actually have to provide that for so many Indigenous communities where that is lacking. Because of all the environmental racism that Canada facilitates, and some other things that you might have heard about concerning this issue is I Don't Know More, and also the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. I will link information on those two things down below. What I'm about to talk about now might make you want to fight me, but please just hear me out on this one, because I'm about to talk about Emily Carr. First, however, we need to discuss in very simplistic terms some of the justifications and logic behind colonialism. One of the main things is the idea of benevolence, and this is something that was driven particularly by religious forces like Jesuits. And in terms of the discourse around colonialism, it was something that was communicated back to the European countries instead of communicating all the actual violence that was happening, because apparently settlers were helping by destroying them. A lot of the philosophical justification and ideas around colonialism came out of the Romantic period with Rousseau and the state of nature and other terrible, terrible ideas. The Romantic period was one of the worst things to ever happen. This in turn informed the Enlightenment period later, and there was a lot of stuff happening in the Enlightenment period in many different areas that contributed to colonialism, including scientific revolution, exploration and discovery, starting to classifying humans, and capitalism, and there was so much stuff happening. One of the justifications that came out of this is the idea of failed modernity. So Indigenous communities and their cultures were dying out because they just couldn't keep up with European settler modernity. They were dying out anyway. This had nothing to do with us. So now to talk about Emily Carr. For those of you who do not know, Emily Carr is a very famous Canadian artist, not only in her painting, but also in her writing. She published many books. She is a massive symbol in Canada, particularly in the province where I live, of British Columbia. Just think about that name, British Columbia, in the context of what we're discussing today. Even particularly in the city where I live, because this is where she lived. There are statues of her here. Her house is a historic site. I know the inn where she died and supposedly haunts. She's buried in a graveyard 5 minutes from my house. She is such an important figure and icon in West Coast identity that whenever I bring what I'm about to up, I get so much resistance. A lot of what Emily Carr painted were important sites to Indigenous communities in the area and other important cultural things like totem poles. So what her art does is depict remnants of material culture, and this contributes to romanticizing Indigenous people and leads to further dehumanization. So what she's doing is viewing this as relics from a primitive history, and therefore we, white people, have the right to collect these relics of a dying culture. Through her vision of the totem poles, they become our vision. And this also contributes to the view as Indigenous people and Indigenous cultures as being homogenous or monolithic. Emily Carr's work is understood as respecting Indigenous culture and community and is celebrating it, and she's seen as this amazing ally to Indigenous people. But she chose to romanticize by depicting dying culture and not what the present situation was. So she was appropriating culture and silencing through her colonial representation. I'm not trying to say that Emily Carr was evil or that she was even intentionally doing this. And people won't even entertain this idea for a second. Like, if I ever bring this up, I have grown adults yelling at me. The point I'm trying to make is how prevalent and accepted colonial logic is in Canada. I am in no way doing this discussion justice, and I will never be able to because, again, white settler privilege. This video was more so a lead up to tomorrow's video, which is going to be talking about books and other academic resources that do the discussion justice.